Hello and welcome to this edition of Business 7. Of course, the publication today in Republikein, Namibian Sun and the Algemeine Zeitung. And if you haven't got your copy yet, make sure to get it. We are covering trade with China. We're also looking at the managing director, the new managing director of Nedbank in Namibia, and her take on the new banking world. And then, of course, our lead covers the fishing industry in Namibia. In the studio, just after this, will be Rowland Brown. He will be talking about the recent fish quota auction, what went wrong, what Namibia could learn, and whether we should continue with it or not. Stay tuned. Fishing and controversy. Joining us in studio is Rowland Brown, a well-known economist and also co-founder of Cirrus Capital. Rowland, welcome, and thank you for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me.
We want to talk especially about what happened at the fish quota allocations. What is your take on that?
So I think it's been fairly widely discussed now. So we're big proponents of these auctions.
Yes.
We think that it's the right approach to take. And there's a number of reasons for that. But obviously, this specific auction didn't go according to plan. The reason that we're in favor of these auctions generally, though, is that there's some sort of fundamental principles that you need to take into consideration when it comes to the nation's resources. So things like the fish in the sea, those don't belong to anyone specifically. They belong to the nation, and the government of the day, as elected by the people, is the custodian of those resources on behalf of their owner, basically the Namibian people. And the kind of critical question around this then becomes, so because those resources belong to the people of Namibia, how do you extract maximum value from them in a sustainable manner? For the people of the country, not for individuals or specific groups, but for the country as a whole. And there's a lot of research that's gone into this globally, and generally speaking, and the principle I think is well understood globally, that these natural resources belong to the people of the country, and the government represents the people with regards to that. So that principle is well understood, and so there's been a lot of research that's been done globally in terms of how do you maximize the value from those resources for the people of the country, and auctions tend to come up close to the top, if not the best way of doing it. And I think that's exactly why we back this idea and why we think that this is the right approach for Namibia. Now, the challenge around this and what we saw in this specific auction is that just because auctions in general are the right approach doesn't mean that a very basic auction is necessarily going to yield the best possible results. And it ultimately comes down to something called price discovery. And the best way to think about this is to think about, for example, a used car auction. If there's one car for sale and you know that you're willing to spend, say $200,000 on that car, but you have no idea what other people are willing to pay, and you have one opportunity to place one bid and that's it, chances are that you're not going to bid your highest price. Chances are you're also not going to bid your lowest price, but you'll go somewhere in between. Everybody else will most likely do the same. And so without that price discovery, you tend to get these peculiar sort of twisted outcomes that don't necessarily result in what the country is looking for. And in this specific instance, I think what we saw is a number of flaws. That was one of them. The fact that this auction was done in a relatively hasty manner, the fact that it was done without, with people still having many other options in terms of how they could acquire local quota, meant that many of the serious players stayed away. There wasn't a pre-approval process, and there wasn't this price discovery. And I think all of those things contributed to this problem. Now, just because there wasn't price discovery in this specific auction, and just because there were a few sort of problems with regards to the execution of this auction, doesn't mean that that principle is in any way undermined. It's still the best way of getting more out of our resource for the people of the country as a whole. And so we still very much back it. What we do say, however, is that we need to look at ways to alleviate the problems that were experienced in this auction. And one of the most critical things there is price discovery. So this is all comes out of a field of maths and economics called game theory, where you basically need to have some idea of what your opponent or the people that you're bidding against is doing in order to better position yourself. And if everybody has that, ultimately you will get the result in the auction that has the maximum benefit for the country. So there's a number of ways that this can be done. You can have a single clearing price, for example, where everybody bids, and the price that sees the whole auction allocated is the price that everybody receives, even if some people bid higher than that. So you know that you can go in aggressively, very high price, and that you are then ensuring that you receive some quota, but that you're not overpaying relative to everybody else. So that's one option, for example. Another option is to have an open bidding process where you can see what other people are bidding. And this is what you see on eBay, for example, where everybody can see this is a good for sale, here's the bidding, I'll put my price in, it'll, somebody might put in a higher price, I can go back and so on. And so you have that price discovery. You can see what other people are willing to pay. A third option is to have multiple rounds of bidding, where you have for example, a pre-qualification condition, so you have to put a certain amount of money in the bank or in the Ministry of Finance bank account before the auction as a deposit, and that allows you to participate in each round of the auction, and you bid. The bottom 2 or 3 bidders fall out and the remainder stay in, and then there's a second round and the bottom 2 or 3 fall out and the remainder stay in until there's basically however much quota is still available. And these types of approaches can alleviate this price discovery problem. And so we encourage that sort of thing. Also things like ensuring that there is a pre-approval process. I think that's very important.
Yeah, that seems to be important.
Making sure that it's done, making sure that there's plenty of upfront sort of awareness of the auction within the fishing sector, not just in Namibia but globally, and saying that we will be doing these auctions on these frequencies and so on. And I think something else that is very, very important, not critical, it's not a deal breaker, but it certainly should be done if we want to really maximize the benefit of these resources for their genuine owners, the people of the country, is that you should be able to fish in Namibian waters if you don't participate through this process. So you should not be able to catch Namibian fish. Yeah. You should not be able to get access to quota through other means. This should be the only way in which you can get access to quota. And as a result, if you want to participate in this sector, you should be required to participate in these auctions. And if we address those things, I think that we'll start to see major improvement with regards to the auction results. There's a couple of other things that we often get challenged on when it comes to this space. One of them is this idea that if you make this available to international players, you are likely to prejudice Namibians, and it's going to be detrimental to Namibian entities. That might be the case, but ultimately, in order to maximize the value of this resource, you need whoever's going to use it most efficiently to be the person who's buying it. Now, if you make it available to international operators, they may well be able to employ efficiencies that we don't yet have here for whatever reason. That should be good for our industry, because it basically means that the nation is getting more value out of the fish stocks that currently exist. When it comes to things like local employment, local ownership, profit retention, and these sorts of things, there certainly are other questions. When it comes to local ownership, I personally don't think that this is something that we should be targeting per se. The reason that I say that is you can go on your quota certificate, on your on your license to catch fish, as it were, you can impose a number of additional conditions, so license conditions. This is very normal across fishing industries globally. It's very normal across other license types of activities. And so you can put those additional conditions on those licenses, and you can say you must do a certain amount of value addition in Namibia. You must employ a certain number of Namibians. You must pay a certain tax, etc., a certain percentage rate in tax, etc. And those conditions can be notarial, right? So it means that you can sell your quota to somebody else if you want.
Okay.
But the right to catch fish is not the only thing you're selling. You're also selling those responsibilities that are attached to that license. And through that, you can get all of the additional benefits, bar potentially the ownership benefit, through those additional license conditions. And if those license conditions are clearly displayed and clearly part of what you're bidding for, people will price accordingly. So if they are very, very arduous requirements, then it will likely reduce the quota price. If they are not major things, then chances are that it won't have too much of an impact on the quota prices. When it comes to the ownership side of it, though, if you are achieving those objectives of having the additional value addition done locally, employment locally, etc., then the additional value that goes with ownership needs to be questioned. As soon as you talk about ownership, if you are basically paying the nation less money so that you can have local ownership, you're basically taking the nation's resources and giving it to that group of owners, which in all likelihood is a minority of the nation's people. If the nation owns that, is the owner of all of that resource, then you are giving that value to the nation as a whole. And what I think is very, very important here is that we often talk about fish quotas as a sort of empowerment scheme. Now, if you ask me, that's an extremely blunt approach to empowerment. We're basically giving people something that has a huge amount of money, a hyper minority of people. We're giving that to them. It has theoretical, it's worth a large amount of money, and it can be relatively easily converted into a large amount of money. And so we give a hyper minority of people that, and that by nature attracts corruption, the fish rot types of things, etc., that we see. It also attracts cronyism. It's not necessarily going out to the population as a whole. So a very small percent of the population gets a disproportionate benefit of the value of that resource that belongs to the nation as a whole. So what we propose rather when it comes to the empowerment side of things is maximize the value that government can generate from this on behalf of the people, and put that money into some kind of vehicle that's used for empowerment purposes. So that's used to help young people start businesses. That's used to improve educational facilities. That's used to make it cheaper and easier for people to get to universities, to graduate, etc., etc. And that is a far less blunt approach to empowerment. The approach to empowerment where we give a small group of people something that's worth a lot of money and hope that it results in broader empowerment is likely to be much less effective than something where you collect the maximum value from the nation's resources possible, use that as strategically as possible to uplift those that have been left behind, to create opportunities for people that want to work and create businesses and jobs and employment and empowerment opportunities for others. And at the end of the day, you're likely to get a far, far better outcome, both with regards to the fishing sector, also with regards to broad levels of empowerment, and finally, it's the right, proper, ethical way of dealing with it, and it can be done in a highly, highly transparent manner, and that's what we're in favor of.
It certainly makes a lot of sense. Do you think that government at the moment is digesting these issues and are working towards a more successful auction the next time?
Yes, so I hope that government is not discouraged by this approach, because it is without a shadow of doubt the right approach to take. There are certainly going to be detractors of the approach, and we hear about it all the time. There's a lot of vested interests in the fishing industry. Bear in mind that what we saw from the fish rot files and what we know from anecdotal evidence and so on is that there are a small group of people who are making large amounts of money in a manner where they're not actually contributing much to the industry, to employment, etc., but under this guise of empowerment. And that small minority of people has obviously got an interest in maintaining the status quo.
Of course.
And so there certainly is that silent pushback and some very vocal pushback. But the principle here is unquestionable. The principle here is that those resources don't belong to a hyper-minority. They belong to the public as a whole. We can't talk about big budget deficits. We can't talk about not having money for education, not having money for housing, not having money to help young people that don't have access to resources to start businesses and create jobs and so on. When we're siphoning off huge amounts of money into the pockets of a handful of people under this guise of empowerment, that's not really contributing to meaningful upliftment of people across the board. So what we've seen from the Ministry of Finance is that they definitely do seem to be keen to continue with this. I think that obviously there's a little bit of a wake-up call associated with the results, or a large wake-up call associated with it. But one thing, that we are very aware of, and something that we try to impress on people in government particularly, is that failing forward is very healthy. Making mistakes and fixing them is very healthy. Being too scared to make decisions because it might not work out is very, very unhealthy. So make the decision, make the mistake, correct it, and move forward. And I think that if we see that from the Ministry of Finance, it will be a very, very positive step. We've been very open about our support of this because the principle is correct, and we will continue to provide our support to it if we are looking to move forward with this approach, because it will be in the interest of the Namibian people and the Namibian nation.
The fact that our first one didn't go well at all, would that detract interest from a second round? Is there a confidence issue, or will it go down in the industry as it failed, but let's try again?
I don't think that the industry is most likely to be the big problem here. I suspect that there were some players that were participating in the auction that didn't have good intentions. There were some players that thought that there was an arbitrage opportunity, so you are a Namibian, you buy the Namibian quota cheap, and you sell it to a foreign operator more expensively, so there's an arbitrage there. So, and again, that's an individual or an entity pocketing a big portion of what should be the nation's resources. So I think that there was some of that. I think the industry also is very aware of the fact that it has a lot of other options to acquire quota. So, and some of those, perhaps many of those, are cheaper. So that's where you need to basically stop undercutting yourself. So in the industry, you basically call it you're cannibalizing your own auction by telling people either you can buy at auction at relatively high prices, or you can go through all these other mechanisms that we have and buy at much lower prices. The latter prejudices the Namibian people who own that resource. That's why we say you need to make sure that all of the resources sold via auction, and that's the way that you're going to maximize the value for the nation. If we then do that, this question of whether the industry is going to support it or not becomes fairly moot, because the industry will close if they don't support it. And we see this in other countries. Mauritania, for example, sells its auction for its sardine stocks or its sardine quota. And Namibian vessels go up and catch that. The same applies globally. Spanish vessels, Portuguese vessels, etc., will happily come and catch fish in Namibian water. And if they're required to set up or buy a factory in Namibia, if the Namibian players decide that they don't want to participate in the auction, somebody else will happily take their place. And I think it may take a while to get exactly where we want to go. But this auction certainly gave us a very clear indication of the value of this resource that we're giving away so easily. And that the value of that resource isn't being realized for the broader Namibian public, but for a relative minority of the Namibian public.
Fishing as a whole, what do you think are the prospects for the sector? It's been a rough couple of years.
Yeah, so the fishing industry is one that tends to be very limited by sort of climatic conditions and by natural factors that we have very little control over, that in terms of going out to catch the fish. And some of the criticism about the auction system is that it's got a huge amount of inherent, you're basically asking people to pay a fixed price for something that has unknown future value, you don't know if you're going to catch it, etc. I'm very skeptical of this type of criticism because, we do it, when you buy the boat, you have the same risk, and yet you still pay the fixed price for the boat. The same applies across many other industries. Farmers go out and plant crops every year and have no idea what's going to happen. And where there's where you have that type of industry, we have risk professionals who both know how to price that risk and also know how to insure for that risk. And that insurance can take many different forms, right? It can be a conventional insurance policy, it can be forward contract, like future contracts, it can be various other things. So there's lots of ways in which that risk can be managed. But the bottom line is that the actual catching of the fish is somewhat uncertain, and so what we tend to see in Namibia is that it bobs around in real terms. So the value changes, but in real terms, your catches sort of bob around a sort of relatively fixed level. The subsequent activities around fishing with regards to the processing, that's where there's historically been sort of more room for sort of additional value addition and so on. But if you look at what we catch, there's quite a lot of value addition done to quite a lot of the hake we catch. We could potentially probably push that to do more value addition of the hake, but there's not a huge amount more scope in our view. The horse mackerel side of things, which is the other major resource that we harvest from the sea here, is one that is a very interesting sort of food commodity generally, in that it's it's viewed by wealthy people as a very inferior product, and it's popular because it's cheap. So it's very, very popular on the continent, where amongst people who are relatively poorly resourced, it's one of the cheapest protein sources on the continent. So chicken, offal, kapenta, these little freshwater fish, and horse mackerel are the three cheapest protein sources on the continent. And so in economic terms, basically it has a very, very high degree of price elasticity. So a small change in the price has a very, very material impact on the demand for the product, because it's demanded because it's cheap. So doing a lot of value addition to it basically means driving up the price, and that tends to have a very negative impact on demand. So there's not a huge amount more that we think can be done in that space. But that's not to say that there's not more that can be done in fishing more generally. I mean, the oyster farms are an example of something that didn't really exist a while ago and is now actually becoming not a huge contributor, but a bit of a contributor to the pot. There's quite a bit of talk around inland fishing, saltwater inland fishing, so fish farms, and things like this. So there's more that can be done there. But I mean, I think from a sort of national accounting GDP perspective, we don't expect anything particularly exciting from the sector over the next year or two.
Any closing thoughts, Rowland?
No, I think the one thing that is important to us is to back good ideas. So we try not to be biased. I think everybody has some degree of inherent bias. We try not to be biased, and when we see these types of initiatives from government where it's the right thing to do, we aren't going to back down because it goes wrong in terms of execution. These principles, getting these principles right, is so fundamental, is so extremely important, that if we are pursuing the right principles and making small mistakes on execution, you mustn't walk away from the principle. You must make amends with regards to or make adjustments with regards to the execution, and that's exactly what we encourage the Ministry of Finance to do.
That was Rowland Brown from Cirrus Capital. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
That's our time, and thank you very much for joining us. We will see you soon. Goodbye.